So the bubonic plague, or Black Death as it's sometimes known, was a pretty fucking big deal in the late Middle Ages. In terms of how the disease first spread to humans, this had a lot to do with the expansion of urban centres and high-density housing, which had caused essentially a massive rat problem through a lot of Europe since, as you can probably imagine, given that it was a time when people were probably bathing like at most once a week, waste management systems of these urban centres in the late Middle Ages were not enormously sophisticated. So rats were the initial carriers of the disease, and then it was actually the fleas on the rats that then transmitted that disease to human hosts after the rats had died. And the symptoms included black sores, which first erupted around the flea bites. Then large swollen protrusions would emerge around the lymph nodes, which, if you don't know, are located around the head, neck, armpits, and groin. These were called buboes. One Italian observer of the time noted that these could be as big as an apple. And then eventually these buboes would release a toxin into the blood that caused neurological damage and later death. The entire process from first contracting the disease to death could take as little as a few hours and as much as a few days. Well, to give a very crash course history answer, in the 1500s, there was this guy called Martin Luther. No, not the same guy as the famed civil rights leader Martin Luther King, who had a dream. Totally different guy, a German monk and professor of theology called Martin Luther. We're not sure if he had any dreams, but we do know that he took big issue with what he saw to be the corruption of the Christian faith through the supremacy of papal authority. So before there was Protestantism, all organized Christianity was overseen by the Catholic Church, of whom the Pope was the supreme leader or head Jedi or whatever the fuck. Martin Luther was very critical of what was essentially the business model of the Catholic Church, wherein so-called indulgences were sold to wealthy Christians as a way for them to lessen the future punishment for their sins on Judgment Day. So essentially, the Catholic Church at this time was in the business of selling people get-out-of-jail-free cards. Their supremacy was also aided by the fact that most people at this time couldn't read, probably didn't have much time whilst avoiding all the rats and the wars and stuff. And also the printing press wasn't yet a thing, so access to written texts was incredibly low anyway, meaning that the church essentially had complete control over the word of God because people were dependent on them verbally telling them what the word of God was. So in 1517, Martin Luther writes out all his grievances with the Catholic Church. Absolutely, Frank Costanza level king. We love the airing of the grievances. And now to circle back on this whole Westphalian thing. International relations scholars argue that the two treaties which end this war, both signed in the German region of Westphalia, are the beginning of modern international relations because they establish the principle of state sovereignty. This meant that, at least in theory, from 1648 onwards, the international order should have been governed by the principle that states do not interfere in the domestic affairs of other states. Now, obviously, this doesn't happen in practice because, again, imperialism, but it does still have significant conceptual implications, particularly for our question of borders. So the concept of sovereignty is essentially made up of three things: universality, territoriality, and citizenry, or in this period, something more like subjecthood, seeing as we didn't have democracy. So we didn't really have citizens. We were more all subjects of a monarch. So on the universality bit, in order for a state to be sovereign, it must have universal authority to set the laws within that state. There cannot be another competing actor in that state, which is why, for example, people on the right wing of the political spectrum nowadays will take issue with international institutions like the European Court of Human Rights because they position this as being something that undermines state sovereignty, because the ECHR can come in and say, for example, to the UK government, hey, that bit of policy that you want to pass breaks our conventions and you can't do that. But people on the left of the political spectrum might emphasize instead that the UK exercised its universal sovereignty as a nation state when it chose to sign up to the ECHR. The universality concept then links to territoriality, because to decide what falls within the state, you must decide the territory, the borders, and then these considerations tail onto this category of citizenry or subjecthood, because alongside deciding the geographical limits, you're also deciding the population limits. You're deciding who is within or without of that state. You're deciding whose sovereignty is being held over. And it's these three pillars that then set the scene for the longer processes of nation state and national identity formation, which are in turn crucial for this question of borders and migration, because this is really the bit where people start to identify foreigners by their nationality rather than by some other attribute like religion, language, the kind of food they eat, what they look like, etc. Now, just as a little side note, I should highlight that historians totally disagree with the argument that national sovereignty is consolidated in this Westphalian arrangement. They argue that this is a much longer and more complicated process because, well, of course they do, right? We, the historians, as a discipline, love to spend about 80% of our time telling other disciplines how they're wrong about history. That's really how we keep ourselves in the game, in a job, yeah? So anyway, that's just as a note. In a bid to keep this section at a reasonable length, though, I'm just going to skip past that discussion because, once again, it bores me and I don't want to talk about it. Instead, what I want to talk to you about is the birth of modern borders. So the original borders essentially consisted of these ad hoc and permanent structures of border control that were very targeted in their objectives, i.e. preventing the spread of disease. And this is the migration regime that most people would have, for the most part, lived under all the way through to the late 19th and early 20th century. It's only at that very late point that we begin to see the kinds of permanent legal frameworks that underpin the sorts of borders that we see today. What I'm saying is, border regulation proper is very much a child of the 20th century, and it emerges under a very specific set of circumstances. So something to bear in mind from the outset is that immigration acts have always targeted specific groups of migrants, whether that be an ethnic or religious group or a labor group, such as what we saw with the first borders, which were targeting primarily sailors arriving in harbours, or today with the points-based system that we have in the UK, where we've essentially created a target social class of skilled workers. The first permanent version of this kind of targeted, codified attempt to control migration in the UK is the 1905 Aliens Act. Now, there had been an earlier Aliens Act in 1793, which targeted French refugees who were trying to escape the reign of terror sparked by the first French Revolution. Side note, why don't we have more reigns of terror these days? I feel like none of the names for our historical eras will slap as much as Reign of Terror. We really need to up our game here in the end days. But anyway, these refugees were fleeing the Reign of Terror and laterally Napoleonic oppression that followed. But this 1793 Act was repealed 30 or so years later, and since no equivalent act seeking to control French immigration came to take its place, that for our purposes, the first non-temporary immigration control legislation in the UK was this 1905 Act. So the group being targeted in 1905 were Eastern European Jews. Now, at this time, Eastern European Jews lived primarily within the Russian Empire, where they were not only second-class citizens in a legal sense, but also subject to ritualized lynchings known as pogroms. Understandably, as a result, many wanted to, get the fuck out of there. So from 1880 onwards, the outward flow of Jews from Eastern Europe increased significantly. Now, they didn't just come to the UK, but a lot of them did come to the UK, which leads to a lot of concern amongst the British political class about the economic and public health effects of a mass movement of peoples who were being characterized as destitute, disease-ridden burdens. Now, a couple of things are happening in the background to strengthen the volume of these complaints. The first is the Second Boer War. So the Second Boer War takes place between 1899 and 1902. The first had been about 10 years earlier, but it's not really important here. And both were essentially imperial wars fought by the British against Dutch settler colonies in modern-day South Africa over territorial disputes in the region. At this time, Britain only really has a pretty small, professionally trained standing army. So to fight this war, they tried to recruit quite widely from the regular population. This served to really throw into sharp relief the devastating effects of poverty, as most of the men who were volunteering for enlistment, who were overwhelmingly from the lower socioeconomic classes, were found to be unfit for war when subjected to a mandatory medical inspection and ultimately had to be turned away. Historian J. Murray Winter estimates that the total amount of volunteers found to be unsuitable for recruitment was anywhere between 40 and 60%. So this is really alarming for the British establishment, right? Because it raises the very real prospect that they're not going to be able to do the whole imperialism thing, which was like their favorite thing to do, because they're literally running out of healthy bodies to fight their wars. At the same time, in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, we're also seeing in the UK the rise of the eugenics movement. Now, some of you may have heard of eugenics, some of you may not. It was essentially like a pseudoscientific theory that believed that you could apply the principles of Mendelian inheritance theory to human populations. Now, Gregor Mendel, who Mendelian inheritance is named after, was amongst other things a biologist, and he studied pea plants to see how the characteristics of parent plants were transferred or not to their offspring. Essentially, he identifies that certain characteristics could be classed as dominant characteristics, and that these would overpower what he called recessive characteristics to be present in the offspring, even if one of the parent plants did not have this dominant characteristic. Now, for the most part, Mendel's principles are ignored outside of things like cattle breeding. But in 1883, a British scientist called Francis Galton tries to apply these same principles to human populations. So where Mendel was looking at plants and animals and saying, well, if these two groups of characteristics breed, this is what the offspring is going to look like. Galton is instead asking, what does it look like when these two kinds of humans breed? Now, obviously, this has really explosive implications, because Galton's theorizing is essentially trying to categorize good and bad stock in human populations in the same way that good and bad stock would be categorized in, say, cows. So the logical follow-through of these categorization efforts is that the presence of bad human stock within your population will lead to the degradation of the health of the whole stock, since the bad stock can do things like expose the good stock to diseases, or if, God forbid, they interbreed, they then produce inferior stock, etc., etc. Now, Galton is by no means the first person to raise the alarm about quote-unquote interbreeding. In fact, concerns about sexual relationships between, for example, black men and white women motivate many of the first laws governing slave colonies in the 1600s. For more on that, listen back to the episode on strong women. But he is reviving this idea and expressing it in the new, shiny, and legitimate language of scientific theory,